she has to leave, and I'm not back, if she could yield to Senator Padilla.
Sounds like a good plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Cruz, for this important hearing. We know the right to vote is fundamental, and we have several important bills coming before us. The first, of course, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Mr. Yang, could you talk about why it's important that the reauthorization include pre-clearance formulas that are geographic and practice-based?
Thank you very, very much for that question, Senator Klobuchar. It's important because we recognize that for minority communities, especially the Latino community and the Asian American community, we're rapidly growing in jurisdictions that are oftentimes not covered by the jurisdictions that would have been historically covered under the coverage formula. Thus, having a practice-based pre-clearance system sets in place to allow for, again, we should remember it's dual triggers. One is the percentage of individuals in that community must, as a demographic matter, reach a certain level. But second is to look at the practice involved. If the practice was historically one that could be used to discriminate against communities, then that would trigger pre-clearance. I think the other important thing to remember about this, going back to what Mr. Sines testified about, is that this provides a form of ADR. Really, it allows for efficient and effective means for looking at different types of manners of voting before they become into law, rather than the costly and very expensive time-consuming aspect of trying to do litigation afterwards.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That's very well said. Mr. Sines, you know, we had this Rules Committee had the first field hearing in 20 years in Georgia, and we learned about their law. I'm going to get to the Freedom to Vote Act in a minute, but and I think a lot of the publicity, understandably, about it has been, oh, no water or food in line from non-poverty. But when you really look at it, it's really quite extraordinarily bad. And this is why so many major companies have come out against it. It is things like you can't vote on weekends during the runoff period, and you can before it, leading to maximum confusion and, of course, inability for many people to vote who thought they could on a weekend. Writing your birthday on the inside envelope on the outside, and, of course, many voters think they should write the date that they cast their ballot, and instead, it's your birthday. The limitation on ballot mail drop-in ballot boxes and the like, and the fact that you can register 29 days before and the runoff is 28 days before. I don't know what else you need to know, in the words of the North Carolina court in another case, that it is discrimination within their words about another law, surgical precision. What is the impact, in just 30 seconds here, because I want to go on to something else, the impact on the laws in Georgia on voter participation, particularly among voters of color and voters in rural areas?
It's potentially very significant. Every time you make it more complicated, more difficult, you are not facilitating a vote, and that's particularly going to have impacts on less frequent voters, those who are newer voters, whether because they're naturalized or only recently turned 18, and those who are elderly. So those are the effects of all of these laws. And I will just add very quickly, Senator, going back to what Mr. Yang said, it's these kinds of crafty laws why we need both coverage formulas, because we won't get the new approaches, new ways of suppressing the vote under practice-based coverage because it's limited to what's specified, but under geographic trigger, we will get the new crafty ways of suppressing the vote.
Right, exactly. So let's talk about that with you, my last series of questions here, Ms. Tolson. Thank you for being here. The crafty ways and what's happening. So I am dismayed that voting rights has always been bipartisan in the past. I remember growing up in Minnesota and the League of Women Voters, and we were proud of our voter turnout. And I'll note that many of the provisions in the For the People bill, and now the more negotiated with Senator Manchin and others, the Freedom to Vote Act, which I'm really proud of, that he worked with me on this through the summer. These provisions get at things that, to me, are common sense. Mail-in voting, that we know so many voters, Democrats and Republicans, used through the pandemic. Just the information we got out of that pandemic, where, you know, so many people voted most ever in the middle of a public health crisis. Why not use those? In my state, these laws, where we usually have the highest voter turnout in the country, I have seen what's happened. We've elected Democratic governors, in our current governor, Tim Walz. We've elected Republican governors with these voting laws, and Tim Pawlenty. We have even elected Jesse Ventura. And what's the thing about it to me? And you've seen this in other states that have strong voting laws. What is it? Well, it means more people feel like they're part of a democracy. And they may come up to me and say, well, I didn't vote for you, but I do agree with you on something like this. They're part of the democracy. We make it easier for them to be part of the democracy. So, Professor Tolson, over 83% of likely voters support public disclosure of contributions, like we have the Disclose Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. Even 57% of likely Republican voters support nonpartisan redistricting commissions. 65% support the option to vote early. You just go through the line. The people are with us on this. Could you talk about why it is appropriate to characterize the provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act as actually for America and not, as some of our colleagues are doing, as partisan?
So I like to think of the act, actually both HR 1 and HR 4 together, but HR 1 in particular it's really a list of best practices, right? You look at what states are doing and you incorporate those practices into a bill that can make sure we have a healthy democracy. So, for example, independent commissions to draw district lines is something that has worked well in states that have adopted them, and that's something that we can apply at a national level in order to decrease the instances of partisan gerrymandering. But coupled with that, HR 4 is a way of protecting minority communities that have historically experienced discrimination, which is also an aspect of a healthy democracy. So I think it's important to view these two bills together to the extent that we're trying to respond to the ways in which voter suppression has evolved. Congress has to evolve too, because voter suppression has certainly evolved. And history has shown that if we don't stay on top of it, then it could definitely take us back 100 years.
Thank you very much. Next up. Okay, Senator Ossoff, I understand, has logged into WebEx.
Thank you for the recognition, and thanks to our panel for joining us today. Professor Tolson, until 20